So now I want to talk about what is political power. Okay, because a lot of what politics is negotiating these relationships and negotiating relationships of power. So we should talk about what power actually means. The textbook for the online course doesn't really delve into power quite as deeply as I'm going to do here, and instead focuses on social control. Remember, it's important that if you're taking the class, you're reading both the textbook and you're watching these videos and you're doing the lectures, which are these videos, and you're answering the questions online. It's important to be doing all of those things to get the full picture. Because this is an introductory course, we're covering a lot of material, and I don't always have time to cover everything in the lectures and the textbook and give you the full picture. So it's up to you to be responsible students and cover both, okay? So what is political power? In the 60s, we start to focus on how people are acquiring and using power, and so we shift that way in anthropology. And then we define political power as a process, not a thing, but a process by which people create, compete, and use power to attain goals that are presumed to be good for the community. So this is important, that in order for it to be political power, you're using this power to reach goals that are supposedly good for the community. Whether they actually are, once they're implemented on the ground, that sort of thing is irrelevant. The point is that these goals that you're trying to reach with your political power are supposed to be good for the community. And political power has to be based on a culturally recognized source. So whether that's through a deity, an ancestor, hereditary, like a hereditary leader that you'll see in a chiefdom, or legal inheritance or elected office like you'll see in a state, the political power has to be based on some culturally recognized source. I can't just stand up and say that I am now politically in charge of the United States. That'd be ridiculous. But if I was elected to be president, then I do have that political power. And if we're talking about political power and power distribution, we have two different ways to think about that. First is going to be non-centralized. So this is just a system where power and control are dispersed between members of the society, so it's a little bit more egalitarian. And then centralized is a political system in which certain individuals and institutions are going to hold power over resources. So non-centralized is kind of spread out. Centralized is specific to one individual or a group of individuals. So think back to band, tribe, chiefdom, and state, and think about which ones might fall under which power distribution category. Okay, so you've got bands and tribes, chiefdoms, and states. Where are they going to fall in terms of non-centralized or centralized power? So if you're taking the class online, go ahead and answer that question below, and I will wait. Okay, so hopefully you were able to connect the egalitarian nature of bands and tribes with the non-centralized distribution of power. And then that would leave chiefdoms and states to be more centralized. So if you're thinking about bands and tribes being egalitarian, focused more on the group as a whole, and on reciprocity and exchange of things, including power, then they're going to fall under this non-centralized, where power and control over resources is more spread out across the population. Whereas chiefdoms and states, where you're starting to see a lot more social stratification and a lot more people in the society, then hopefully you connected that with a political system where you've got several people or several institutions holding the majority of the power. There are going to be a few ways to think about power, and so one of them is through action theory. And what we're doing here is we're following daily activities and decision-making processes of individual political leaders. Okay, so this isn't just a random person on the street. This would be someone who has that socially recognized or appointed power. Okay, what we're focusing on here is that politics is very dynamic. It's always a give and take. It's a go-between between people with power, people without power, kind of renegotiating these relationships all the time. Okay, and so you're always managing or trying to create or recreate or maintain this ability to exercise power over other people. And so, and here it's not enough to just be the president of the U.S. You also have to act like the president of the United States. So the decisions you're making and the processes you're engaging in have to reflect your status as a political leader. Okay, and so it's important that you aren't just having the title, but that you're living that title. We can also think about structural power, and this is where we're thinking that political power will transcend the individual. Okay, so it's not only operating within specific settings, but it's also creating that setting in which people are interacting. Okay, it's not just power being held in individuals, it's power in institutions. And so power in this sense is going to be dispersed in a lot of different ways, and then it's going to be produced and reproduced not just through the person with the power, but also through a combination of actions of important social institutions and regular people living their lives. So by following the laws and by treating the president as the president in your daily life, you are recreating and reproducing this power. Okay, and that isn't always a bad thing, right? Power is not always negative, though sometimes it feels that way. And then if we want to talk about gender and political power, your textbook does a pretty good job actually of talking about this. And so the idea is that men dominate formal political processes, that women don't have a lot of say or a lot of place in these organizations, whether it's in Western societies, if it's in a band, a tribe, a chiefdom, or a state, it's pretty much the same. Yes, we do have examples of female leaders, right? We've got a woman running for president right now. We have queens, like the Queen of England is obviously a woman. Okay, and so there are these exceptions to the rule, but men are still dominating the formal political process, and a lot of times these women have their power in relationship to their male counterpart. So the Queen of England is the queen either because their father had no heirs, or the husband, she's married to the king, and so now she is the queen. Women don't tend to reach these levels of political power the same way that men do, and then they also tend to, in Western societies, have to downplay their responsibility or their relationship with feminist goals or ideals in order to get there. So your book uses the phrase, they're generally men in women's clothing, so they're women who are portraying themselves more as men, and I don't mean in terms of gender identity like we talked about a couple weeks ago. What we mean is that in order for women to reach the same level of political power or the level of political power we can see them in today, they often have to discount women's issues and play the role more similar to that of their male counterparts. And so citing Hillary Clinton running for president as a reason, or citing that to counter the statement here on the screen that men dominate formal political processes, doesn't actually work. She's an exception, and to get to that point, she's had to downplay some of her participation or emphasis on female issues to get to that point. That being said, there are still instances where women are in formal leadership roles and political power. It's just kind of checked by what we just mentioned. And then where women have little formal power, they'll often assert power in other informal ways. And there are some really cool examples, one of which we'll talk about here in just a second. But basically where women don't have formal power, they start to find other ways to exercise power. And that's generally in day-to-day interactions or in smaller scale than being the chief or being the president. And so that example for you would be in a lot of Islamic communities, clerics will justify restrictions, Sharia or customary Islamic law. And so if you're studying how women who in these situations don't have a lot of power, how are they exercising their power? And so sometimes they will go behind these rules and they'll kind of circumvent the rule. So yes, they'll wear their headscarf, but they'll wear it in a modern way. Or as you can see, the woman there has her hair peering out from just the front of her headscarf. Wearing headscarves that are patterned as opposed to just black or bright colors, I think is really what they're showing in that picture there. Okay, and then they can also, for example, take women's pilgrimages where clerics aren't there to interfere. So the women can go and do what they want to do, and they can have this pilgrimage that's women only. And so these are just a couple examples of ways in which women exercise power, even if they don't have formal political power.